areas where there's potentially significant risk that needs to be addressed or avoided. In this afternoon's program, we'll start with a level set on generative AI. We'll then hear from 3 healthcare startups that are harnessing AI in different ways to create solutions across the healthcare landscape. And then this afternoon, we'll conclude with a panel of healthcare professionals with different perspectives on the seemingly endless possibilities and potential pitfalls that a future with AI holds. We have been a partner of Northwestern University and Northwestern Medicine since we opened Matter in 2015. They've been a terrific academic partner and a terrific partner as a health system. And this is the first program like this that we have collaborated on together. We've been delighted to do so. Thank you to Dr. Daniel Derman, who leads the Mansueto Institute, and his whole team at the Institute. Thank you as well to our speakers and our panelists. We have more than 1,000 people registered today. So if that's any indication, there's a clear appetite for information and insights about the use of AI in healthcare. And with that, I would like to introduce our first speaker of the day, who is joining us virtually. I guess I should have shown the agenda. Here's the agenda, what you'll see. This is me. More importantly, our first speaker is Harjinder Sandhu, who's the Chief Technology Officer of the Health and Life Sciences Platforms and Solutions at Microsoft. Harjinder started an AI company that was acquired by Nuance, that was acquired by Microsoft, which is how he ended up there. He's going to kick off our symposium by laying the groundwork of generative AI. Harjinder, welcome, thank you, and take it away.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me. And I'm going to talk, I guess, for a little bit on how we've been thinking about generative AI within Microsoft. And, you know, I've been very fortunate over the last year to be kind of in, I guess, in a front row seat watching from its inception, from when ChatGPT was first announced about a year ago. We had a chance, some of us, to start look at that technology a little bit before it was publicly announced and start playing with it. And so a lot of the facets of that technology, as they've come to light and as people have begun to explore those, have been obviously very much of interest to us, and particularly looking at how this is going to impact healthcare. And one of the areas that we've started focusing on more and more, that initial phase was really just exploration for the first few months and just kind of that awestruck, like, wow, this can do so many different things. And then once the reality hits that, you know, it's not that easy to actually put this into practice. It's a new language that we're learning in terms of how to develop applications around this, how to operationalize this. So I'm going to talk for the next little bit around the process of operationalizing AI and what some of the issues and concerns are. A lot of this might be basic for many of you, because I know as you're diving deeper into this, the issues that I'm going to talk about are something that you go through and you confront, and then you go past and start diving deeper and deeper. So hopefully this will be of some interest for the audience here. So I probably don't need to belabor this point to this audience, at least. AI is going to impact pretty much every facet of healthcare. I can't imagine any area of healthcare that's not going to be touched. If you were to look at a couple of the areas that I highlight here in terms of improving the way providers work, things like ambient clinical intelligence, which is now skyrocketing, chart summarization, if you think around administrative costs, around medical coding, chatbots for scheduling and triage and so forth, reducing medical errors through AI oversight, improving access to care, which I think is going to become a huge thing in the years to come, upskilling medical staff. And then one of the areas that we're spending a lot of time on within Microsoft Research is the entire idea of personalizing medicine, being able to apply real world evidence to treatment protocols and diagnoses and so forth. So there's a lot of different areas, and we could go on and spend hours on just all the different ways in which AI is going to impact healthcare. In my day job, I spend a lot of time working with strategic customers of Microsoft, with health systems, thinking through, well, how do you go from what invariably every health system begins with is this kind of smorgasbord of, well, here's all the areas that we think we can apply generative AI to. And I've been in sessions literally where the health system will come up with hundreds, 300, 400 different use cases and say, well, here's all the things that we think we could do. And then comes the next inevitable step, which is, well, all right, we can't do them all. Which ones do we focus on? And the way we started thinking about this is through this kind of funnel. And if you think about this funnel from the top, where you start with a lot of different use cases, and how do you get to that bottom tier where you're looking at, well, which ones do I operationalize? What I need to think about from a deployment perspective, and you go through these different gates. And I think of these as several different gates in that process. The first and most important one is risk when it comes to healthcare. I'm going to talk a little bit about risk and how to kind of think about risk with respect to healthcare applications. And this is an area that Microsoft spends a lot of time thinking about. The next one is performance, which obviously now you can take performance a couple of different ways. The way I'm thinking about it here is in the context of how well does the large language model, the generative AI model, perform in the context of the specific application you're trying to implement. The next gate is one of cost. And this turns out to have become an important one because GPT-4 is by far the best LLM out there. Even despite all the different noise and stuff that's going on in the industry, we've still been able to see GPT-4 performance on most general medical use cases being the best. But the caveat is that it's very expensive. And if you were to try to apply GPT-4 for every single task that you want to use an LLM for, you're going to pay an exorbitantly high cost. And so one of the things that we've started doing over the last 4 months or so is started to think about cost a little bit different. I'll talk a little bit about this, but largely it centers around, well, what do you need to use GPT-4 for, or whichever your best top tier AI model happens to be. It might not always be GPT-4. And which ones can you apply smaller models for? And so as you start thinking through those cost dynamics, that becomes an important criteria. The operationalization piece is that next piece. And even after you get past all these other gates, there's a huge hurdle here around, well, how do I operationalize this? What do I need to be thinking about? And then lastly comes deployment. So I'll go through a little bit of this in the short period of time here. Starting at that top of that funnel with the first gate being risk. Within Microsoft, we talk about this in the lens of responsible AI. So Microsoft has this very strong program in the area of responsible AI that spans all of Microsoft in all the different areas that Microsoft is applying AI. Within healthcare, what we do is we kind of apply our healthcare lens on top of that and think about all of these criteria. So the 6 criteria of responsible AI are kind of cross-industry, applied to anything, and then the particular points above and below them are the healthcare specific points. If you think about some of these that you really have to be thinking about, fairness is obviously a really important one. In the healthcare context, you can think about that in terms of bias as one, and maybe the most important one around fairness. All of the LLMs have bias. They're biased in large part because they're trained on human data, and that data is inherently biased. I'm going to talk a little bit more about bias later on as well, but briefly, this is something that is inherent and something that as you're deploying and thinking about what particular applications you're going to deploy with generative AI, you have to keep at the forefront of your thoughts. From a reliability safety perspective, one of the most important things is that these LLMs don't always give you accurate information. The word hallucination has taken on a new meaning over the last year, and everybody is now familiar with that term in the context of LLMs. Sometimes they hallucinate. They make up facts and then present them as reality, and guarding against that and making sure that you're, again, in a patient safety context is a huge, huge issue. And who's interpreting and looking at those results matters. privacy and security is a really big deal. Now, there are different aspects to privacy and security. One of them people worry about, well, if I enter a prompt, is the LLM actually learning and remembering that prompt? Is that going to get leaked and used in some fashion? And that within the context of what we do within Microsoft tends to be less of a concern. The LLMs themselves are memoryless. They don't remember anything of what you actually did. Every time you do a prompt, they process it, they spin out a bunch of tokens, and they're done. They never remember what you did. But there's a software layer on top that might be actually remembering what you typed and remembering the responses that the LLM gave. So if you use ChatGPT directly, for example, there's that software layer, that ChatGPT layer is doing all that remembering. If you're doing building applications using the Azure OpenAI endpoints, for example, Azure itself isn't going to remember anything. It's not keeping track of what you're typing. In fact, we provide guarantees that we're not using your data, we're not remembering that data, but the applications that you're using may. And so this is more of a question about, well, what applications are you using that are delivering those features, the LM features for you, and how are they treating privacy and security? There's another aspect to this, of course, which is that if you're fine-tuning some of these LLMs, which is now possible, you can apply your own data to those LLMs. If you're using patient data to fine-tune those LLMs, are those LLMs going to leak that patient data? Do they memorize some of that patient information and then potentially reveal it to somebody else when they're using that LLM? And that's an entirely different type of privacy that you do have to worry about. And again, within the Microsoft context, we have tools that you can choose to apply when you use fine-tuning, which are called differential privacy, which can guarantee that if you train it on a set of data, that the LLM won't remember any specific data set. So if you train it on a lot of patient records, for example, through differential privacy, we can guarantee that it's not going to remember any specific patient. It'll aggregate that information before processing it for learning perspective. But still, privacy and security tends to be a huge issue to think about as you go through this operationalization process. And some of these others, I won't go into a lot of details in this short amount of time: inclusiveness, transparency, accountability. Of course, there's a lot of regulatory issues, and we're kind of, a lot of the health systems I see applying generative AI are skirting right on the edges of some of these regulatory issues, and a lot of things to think about and go through there. But when it comes to actually evaluating use cases, again, some of this is going to come across as relatively obvious if you've been thinking about it for more than an hour even. The way to think about this and the way we generally work with health systems when we're thinking through this is to apply it on this scale of value versus risk. Now, from a value perspective, that's up to each individual health system or user base to think about, well, what is the value of a particular use case? When I put these up here, I'm assigning my own value to a couple of the examples that I gave here, and I'll walk through those in a sec. But the other axis, of course, is risk. And this I believe to be the two most important ways to do that first level of evaluation to see, well, should I be actually deploying this use case? Is it worth spending my time on this particular use case? So if you think about this value risk scale, and you think in the top left, something like ambient note generation, which, as I said, is becoming one of the most important and hottest use cases, at least from the perspective that we're seeing right now. This is what almost every health system is trying to implement right now. It's a relatively high value. Some would say extremely high value, but relatively low risk. And the reason we assign relatively low risk to this use case is that when a physician is involved in a conversation with a patient, what the ambient note generation is doing is it's listening in on that conversation and then producing a clinical note. When it produces that clinical note is going to, right now, it's going to have errors in it. There's going to be potential hallucinations in that, things that the LM just made up. There's going to be omissions in there, things that were important, but the LM didn't bother putting into the clinical note. But the important thing here is that the physician or provider that just did that conversation with the patient is the one very shortly thereafter, most likely, reviewing that clinical note. So they have the full context of what the conversation they just had was and what the LLM just produced. So they're able to actually detect any errors. It's saving them obviously a lot of time and grief to try to produce that note from scratch. But the low risk comes from the fact that there's a human in the loop and a human that has full awareness of both sides of that conversation, of both the original conversation and the clinical note. Now, if you look at chart summarization, and I know there's health systems that are deploying chart summarization, so I'm not saying by this that you cannot deploy it, but there remains a lot of risk around that. And the reason is that if you think about the context in which you would want an AI system to generate a summary of that chart, if a patient is a complex patient, they've got dozens potentially clinical notes in there, they've got lots of lab results, so on and so forth. And as a provider, you'd want to be able to go up to your system and say, hey, just give me a summary of this patient. This patient's coming in for an ankle sprain. What do I need to know? And the challenge here is that in this context, if the LLM hallucinates, if it makes up something that's not in the chart or emits something really important in that chart, the physician isn't in a position most likely to actually know this, because the reason they're asking for a summary is they don't want to read the original chart. They don't want to spend that 10, 15 minutes that it would require to actually go and peruse the whole chart and generate that summary themselves. So depending on the context in which you deploy this, and as I said, there are systems that are deploying this in various ways, but depending on the context, you have to be really careful. You have to make sure that the user experience that you're creating doesn't lend itself overly much towards ignoring what's actually in the chart and just relying solely on that summary. On the other side of this, if you think about some of the use cases such as scheduling, which some might think of this as much higher value than I've put it here, there's certainly value in using AI for scheduling use cases. The risk is also relatively low because in the worst case, what can happen, hopefully, you're not doing anything more in the worst case than potentially scheduling the patient in the wrong time slot and not doing something much more drastic than that, hopefully. So if you think about it in that context, well, it's not quite as high as value as some of the clinical use cases you might deploy it, but it's also not as high risk, relatively easy to put in place. If you think about something like language translation, which again, you can decide what the value is in that, but I put it as somewhat lower value than some of the things like chart summarization and things, but also high risk as well. And again, similar to chart summarization, is the person that's actually getting using the AI in this case in a position to know both sides of the before and after, the both languages that the system is translating from. And two, if they do, they're probably not needing that language translation in the first place. And if they don't, they only hear one side of that conversation, one language, and not in a position to know whether the AI system is making a mistake. So when you think about evaluating risk, the single most important criteria is a human in the loop. Is that user qualified to interpret the results? Obviously, you could put a human in the loop that is not in a position to make a clinical judgment if you're using AI for a clinical use case. What happens in the worst case if the system fabricates information? Can the system be well grounded in real data and provide citations? This is actually, I think, a must in things like chart summarization. And one of the risks that I think will persist and will become a bigger deal as some of these other ones get solved is there a danger of procedural over-reliance? As these systems become better and better, do we become so reliant on them, knowing that the last 20 times I used this, it actually gave me exactly the right answer, but that 21st time, it's actually going to make a mistake, and we no longer are paying attention to that. So there are a lot of risks here. Obviously, from a Microsoft perspective, we're strong proponents of generative AI and fully on board with deploying a lot of different use cases, but we're doing so with kind of this note of caution and looking at it from this perspective. Well, we have to be really careful about which use cases we deploy today or work with our customers to deploy, and which ones are still a little bit on that edge where we want to be a little bit careful. Now, as you're thinking about LLMs broadly, there are a lot of limitations in LLMs currently, and some of these, if you think about medical imaging, GPT-4 Vision is actually phenomenally good at imaging in the broader context. So you can give it images of parks, animals, people, and it will do a really good job interpreting what it's seeing in that image. But when it comes to medical imaging, it's not particularly good. It's in fact terrible right now. We are working on medical imaging. There's a huge project within Microsoft to actually address this. We did an early reveal of some of that work at RSNA in November. But medical imaging is one of those areas that you'll see developing over the next year or so, but is not there today. It's not something you could actually reliably use LLMs for interpreting medical images today. And a lot of that, by the way, and a lot of the next use case I'm going to talk about, or the next area here, has to do with the limitations of what data these LLMs are being trained on, the LLMs that are being released to the public, at least. So GPT-4 is trained on a lot of public data, textbooks, journals, websites, articles, and so forth. What it doesn't have is a lot of medical images to train on, and what it doesn't have is a lot of real-world patient data to train on either. So when it comes to understanding patient longitudinal care, what it does know is a lot of textbook evidence. It knows disease progression from a textbook perspective, but what physicians gain through 20, 30 years of experience, these LLMs don't have. Now, there's a lot of efforts. We're working with health systems as well to help them fine-tune LLMs with their own private data. This is where some of those privacy issues I talked about and applying differential privacy and some of those techniques become important. But there are lots of efforts underway now to actually train these LLMs so that they actually do understand patient disease progression, patient care, treatment, and so forth based on actual evidence, based upon all the data that the health systems have been amassing for many years. And so there's a lot of promise that these LLMs will actually become much, much smarter, understanding how to treat and how to diagnose and so forth. Context windows tend to be relatively limited right now. If you don't know what that means, it basically means there's only a certain amount of tokens, or you can think about them as words, that you can supply to the LLMs right now. The largest ones right now, so GPT-4, when it first came out, had a 4K, 4,000, then 8,000, 32,000, and now the latest one that was announced was 128,000 tokens. Again, somewhat akin to words if you are not familiar with the word token. But that's still not enough to supply an entire patient chart potentially, and all the clinical guidelines and other things that you might want to supply it. So there's a lot of techniques. Many of you might have heard of these already, retrieval augmented generation called RAG, and other techniques that are being applied to try to figure out how do we supply just the right information to the LLM so that it can give us the right answer. Over time, these context windows are getting larger and larger, so this will probably become less and less of an issue as time progresses, but certainly it's a major issue right now. The LLMs, the lack of awareness of the latest medical advancement guidelines, LLMs are trained on a point in time. GPT-4, when it was first announced, was trained on some point in 2021. It had no awareness of anything that had happened after that point. The November release of GPT-4 updated that to, I believe it was April of last year. So the current GPT-4 that's out there has knowledge of most medical literature that has happened up to that point. But again, it doesn't have any awareness of anything that's happened since then. And it probably doesn't have any awareness of any guidelines that you might have that are private to you that you don't publish publicly. And so there's a lot of interesting work and a lot of research around how do we make them aware of just the right guidelines and that we want to apply in this particular context. I mentioned this earlier about bias, clinical bias, stereotyping, lack of sensitivity to region, ethnicity. These are, again, things that, as you're thinking about building these applications, are things that you have to build into the LLMs to be aware of this, to overcome some of these, and the issue of hallucinations, which we talked about already. So when it comes to safety and grounding, I'm not going to go through this in a lot of detail. This is kind of a broad architecture we use at Microsoft to think about how the overall stack works of concern. So at the bottom, you have the AI infrastructure. That's, in our case, that's Azure. You have the foundation models, which is just another term for generative AI in this case. Now, most foundation models have become generative AI. And we have hosted models, hosted fine-tuned models that others are producing that we're hosting. And obviously, health systems and others are coming in and building their own models, fine-tuning their own models and using it themselves as well. On top of that is this really important there. And at the very top, of course, is if you're building an application or deploying an application, that's where your application sits with its own UX and a lot of the prompt engineering and stuff. In between that is this orchestration layer. And this is a really important layer to think about. This is where a lot of the important safety stuff, now safety is a concern across all these different layers, but a lot of the important safety stuff happens at that orchestration layer. This is where a lot of the prompts that somebody might supply and the responses are getting filtered to make sure that it's not doing anything dangerous or inappropriate. There's a meta prompt that you'd want to put in place that gives general guidance to that LLM and how it should behave. There's some grounding tools here for applying patient context, applying clinical guidelines, other kinds of context you might want to put into place. So overall, this is this new layer that's just materialized over the last year. Didn't really exist before, but now it's specific to the way LLMs are being used. You're using not generally, you can use the foundation model or the LM directly, but generally we recommend using it through an orchestration layer that's helping you to do a lot of these things rather than building it all yourself from scratch. Now, one of the big things, of course, and everybody's heard of the idea of prompt engineering, how you ask a question makes a big difference. So this is one of my favorite examples. I did this about 2 months ago on GPT-4. I asked, is 450 90% of 500? And GPT-4 answers emphatically no. Now, if I'd stopped there and said, okay, no, this is not true, and I, for whatever reason, use this response in my application, I would come to a wrong conclusion because as GPT-4 continues, it starts working thus out. And this is actually, by the way, very similar to the way my kids used to operate is, you know, I ask a question and they emphatically state an answer. And then as they start thinking about it, I say, oh, wait a minute, maybe I was wrong about that. In this case, GPT-4 has this ability to do chain of thought reasoning, which means it starts working through how to arrive at a question, at an answer. And as it does this, 450 is not 90% of 500. It says, well, let me show you how to actually calculate it so I can verify that I gave you the right answer. And as it does this, it realizes, oh, wait a minute, I actually got it wrong. 450 actually is 90% of 500. And again, the point here is obviously twofold. One is these LMs can make mistakes. They do make mistakes. They're stunningly good at being able to work through these problems, but they do make mistakes. And how you ask that question really matters. If you ask a question in a particular way without asking it to reason through that, there's a lot of evidence over the last year that if you ask an LLM math questions, for example, and ask it to work through that question, essentially this idea of chain of thought, tell me how you actually get to the answer before you give me the answer, it will actually give you accurate results much, much more often than if you just ask it for a straight out, just give me the answer. I don't care how you worked it out. It'll give you false answers much more often. And so this was actually reinforced. This chart is a little bit complicated, but there was this work within Microsoft Research on this strategy called MedPrompt, which is basically this idea that how can we take medical question answering and improve that accuracy? And so in GPT-4, if you look at this blue at the very bottom of this chart, so by default, GPT-4 has about an 82% accuracy on medical QA. If you do nothing special, you just ask it a question and it gives you an answer. But if you start applying some of these techniques, this random 5-shot is basically just give it 5 examples before you actually ask it the question you want to ask. 5-shot chain of thought is you ask it, give it 5 examples, but also show it how to work through those examples before you before you ask it to answer your question on the particular one, and so on and so forth. And you can see applying these different techniques. These are all just different ways of prompting the system. You can actually go from just a shade below 82% all the way up to 90% accuracy on the same set of questions. And so this is a pretty substantial gap. And again, the point here is that prompt engineering is really, really important. How you work with these systems matters. I'm going to skip through some of this because I know we're short on time, but from an operationalization perspective, generally what we think about, and as we work with health systems on going through this process, we think about it from this multi-stage process. So the first step, which most health systems have done in some fashion by now, is you start envisioning the wide spectrum of possible use cases. What are the things I want to be able to do? You focus on a couple. You pick the couple of use cases that you say, well, these are the high value, low risk, high reward kinds of use cases I'm going to build. and you start operationalizing those. One of the most critical things here is to gather experience. Everybody is new to this, bar none. Everybody in the entire planet is new to the way LLMs operate. This is a process that everybody started just about a year ago or more, a little bit more than that. And so we're all trying to learn, how do we actually operationalize these? What are the things that we have to start learning? It's a new, as I said at the outset, it's a new language. Traditional software was built in a particular way where you build that software, you test it, you deploy it. There might be some bugs that you're going to discover when it's in the field, but given the same inputs, that software is always going to produce the same results. And we've learned how to deal with deploying software. We've had now 40, 50 years of experience doing that. This is something new. Now we're dealing with software that LLMs that have opinions. They have viewpoints. Now we have to deal with something that has a different degree of intelligence and whose behavior changes over time, because even GPT-4, for example, isn't static. It's not something that just gets released and then that's it. Within Microsoft, we see updates of GPT-4 happening on a regular cadence. Every few weeks, every couple of months, there's a new release of that. That goes under the hood, and the behavior of these LLMs change slightly. And so now you have to think about things like prompt drift, the fact that the prompt that you wrote at one point in time might not work exactly the same. You might not get exactly the right answers, the same answers a month or two later or 6 months later, as some of the parameters of that LLM shifted over that time. So these are really important things to start thinking about, but what's most important is get a couple of use cases into production at a low scale, low risk environment and start gathering experience about what it takes to actually run these applications using LLMs over a period of time. I'm going to end with this last slide. What does the near future hold? Now, it's anybody's bet on what the near future is going to look like, but based upon kind of just the work that I see going on both within Microsoft research and within the field at large, here's a couple of the trends that I think are going to be there. And this is the near future. I'm thinking the next year or two, you're going to start seeing a lot of this. You're going to see a lot of new health optimized models. There's a lot of work that we're doing that others are doing on optimizing these LLMs for healthcare. You're going to see a lot of them getting fine-tuned with more data and with more patient data. For example, those are going to be health systems that are building it for themselves, deploying it for themselves, but you might eventually start seeing those being produced for the public as well. You're going to see a lot of prompt engineering techniques coming out. We see them every couple of weeks. We see some new prompt engineering technique coming out. You're going to see better orchestration frameworks that are better at helping you ensure safety, quality, all that kind of stuff. And what you'll see as a result of a lot of this, just because there's so much focus on this, that problem of hallucination is going to start to go down substantially. It's not going to go away entirely, but it's going to come down substantially. So as you're thinking about this and you're worrying about, well, these systems are really bad at hallucinating, there's a lot of research focus on this right now, on this very problem. The reliability of these LLMs is going to come up. Reliability here just means that, when you're using them on the same kinds of things over and over, right now, they could be all over the place. One time, they're going to give you a really good answer. Another time, they give you a crappy answer. That reliability is a huge area of focus. Transparency, their ability to cite and give you evidence is going to improve. The one area that's going to be the hardest to solve, and you're going to, if we're having this conversation 2 years from now, I suspect we're still going to be having this conversation, is going to be around bias. And this is largely because bias is subject to the data that these systems are being trained on. Now, a lot of these systems, GPT-4 can actually reason about bias. If you ask it about its own biases, it can actually tell you about those biases. But whether it can do anything about those is really depending on the data that it gets trained on. So applying real world evidence to a lot of clinical use cases is really important, but then that evidence, that data that you're applying might have its own bias as well. So I think this is the one area that is really important. It's a long-term issue, but by and large, I see the near future getting better and better in terms of how you can deploy these LLMs and what kind of issues you're going to be confronting. Thank you very much.
think the room is muted, by the way.
Unknowns as well. So thank you very much for at least leveling us up and getting us started. Those that are in the room are spread out here, and there's probably about 40, 50 some people here in the room. But this is a little bit like C-SPAN. There could be few people that are actually listening to the Congress people, but we had over 800 people that are in virtual screening rooms as well listening to this. So it's very well attended. And I appreciate everybody's effort in terms of being part of this. So let's move on now. With that context, I think we can move on to some specific examples of real life use indications of using the technology today. So we're going to hear from 3 different solution spotlights today. And the first up is Farouk Khan, founder and CEO of Inference Analytics. Then we'll hear from Sam Glassenberg, the founder and CEO of Level EX, which is a training program, which you can see. And then we're also going to hear from a colleague from Microsoft, from Nuance, about outpatient automation. We're going to do that over the course of the next 30 to 40 minutes or so. So Farouk, you're first up.
Thank you, Dr. Durman. Thanks for having us. Inference Analytics is a company that I founded in 2016, and I'm going to walk you through who we are, some background to us first, because we're a small company, we're not Microsoft, but we've been at it for a while, right? And so I just wanted to paint that picture a little bit for how a startup goes about getting into this space and how we got into Gen AI. So just some perspective, back in 2018, if you were doing AI in healthcare, the typical assumption was you were doing something with image, because AI was all about image CNN models, right? That automatically detected cancer from some kind of an image, and that was a use case. We actually were guided by some advisors who I value a lot now, to stay on text, right? And so we got some very rich text, basically radiology text, and we built an AI team. And in 2018, that work was called NLP, natural language processing. So we were doing natural language processing in 2018. There was no LLM. We built our own concept of an LLM, which was we named it a narrative cloud, right? And so that narrative cloud did not have the ability to do what LLMs can do now. So every other prediction was a hallucination, right? So it was almost like we would hallucinate more than half the time. But anyway, fast forward from there, right? We would join the NVIDIA AI innovation program. We were part of their accelerator. We actually published a paper using radiology reports to predict text. So this is where Gen AI started forming in our head, right? That we could take text inside radiology and we could generate the rest of the report. And so that paper got published in IEEE. And then, forward from that point, we actually then got closer to NVIDIA and we actually validated their Biomegatron model. So this was a model that predates GPT-4 and 3. And this was a model that they had built. And so we collaborated with them closely. And that was another way for us to get closer to this whole AI wave that was going on. And then in 2020, I'm going to fast forward a little bit, we get to sort of 2022, and we started building a framework for how to do generative AI. We realized that there was these concepts of GPT. We were not the only ones that were doing text generation. There was GPTs were around, they were predicting. We looked at GPT-2s, the early version of GPT-3, and we saw what that could do. And that brought us to the advent of ChatGPT. Right, and when that happened, our guys, and I have a team of like several PhDs, researchers, and they were all looked at me. They're like, "What the heck, man? How did this happen?" Right, and now we have ChatGPT. But anyway, we realized where we were. We realized the value that we had. What we'd already built, and we started developing a framework. And so today it was interesting listening to the talk about orchestration. So what we've built effectively is a concept of doing AI orchestration within a healthcare context, right? And so I'm I gave you this overview so you understood who we are. I mean, we're basically data analytics, AI researchers, all Chicago-based, so very friendly audience, right? And also working with a large institution now. So, the part that I missed was that the culmination of that work is now we have a contract implementing AI and Gen AI actually in a large healthcare system here. I can't name them, but they're not Northwestern yet, right? So anyway, let's give you a little bit, and now let me take a step back, right? So what are the typical challenges when we started looking at this? What are the challenges the healthcare organizations face? So obviously unstructured data, a lot of it, right? 80% of all data in healthcare is unstructured. HIPAA limits how you can use it, who you can share it with. So there's a lot of regulatory restrictions. And then AI expertise, and I say it with a caveat, right? There's a lot of good AI research going on, but my learning in being able to do radiology AI and then jumping back into doing enterprise AI is that, the organizational level, I almost call it corporate level AI teams are thin, right? And so while there is AI research going on in pockets, so you will have radiology teams going at it, you probably have oncology teams going at it, but where is their enterprise-wide AI efforts, right? And so that's kind of what I found, at least in the institution that we were working, was missing. And so, and while we're doing all this, and while we signed this contract with this system, one of the other facts that people have to address is that 60% of US hospitals are operating in the red, right? So there is a need to do more, to operationalize better, to create more efficiencies. And so the way we think about this is that, we break it up into 3 layers, and pretty simple, patient-facing, physician-facing, and sort of organizational, right? And so each of them have needs that could be improved, right? Patients want better care. They want faster access to providers. They want to reduce cost. Physicians do not want to get burnt out. They don't want to spend their time writing reports or writing SOAP notes. They also want good care for their patients. And organizations want to reduce the inefficiencies, right? Billing comes up as a big use case. And so, the whole idea is we've looked at these as individual areas. And as an enterprise-focused solution, we kind of, sort of break it down in terms of these 3 waves of how we're approaching it. And so what is it that we're doing? And I'm not going to do a demo today, but hopefully we'll have time to do a demo to Northwestern about what we're doing. But the core focus for us is that we are an AI orchestration platform. And what that means is that we are not just an LLM. There is an LLM operating inside our orchestration layer, but there are other things that need to be done. So there's firewalling that needs to happen. There's a HIPAA compliance that needs to be done. There is, the hallucinations have to be avoided. There's factual correctness that has to be done. And each of these has to be done appropriately, meaning, as was pointed out earlier in the talk, that using an LLM for the wrong task is very expensive. These are expensive solutions. And so where you don't need to use them, you should not use them. You should use other types of AI platforms. And so that is the layer, right? That's the underlying orchestration sort of platform that we've built. And that is now leads us to the whole point of, okay, so what are the use cases we're going after? And we break it down into those 3, right? So there is what we call a physician concierge. So us being unique, do not like to use the word co-pilot. So we came up with this thing called concierge, right? And so, but the name kind of says what it is, right? So what is a physician concierge? So today, if you try to schedule an appointment, and I'm sure everybody is working at this, but it's kind of complicated to get an appointment with a doctor, right? And so we have a patient solution that you can go into, and you can say things like, I need an appointment on the 3rd Wednesday of next month, right? And I need it between 4 and 6 o'clock, and I need it with somebody who accepts this insurance, and it's going to give you those options. And so you can, you can go in and sort of select those providers. You want to ask questions about, okay, tell me everything about what Northwestern, for example, recommends about caring for diabetes, right? And so we will make sure that those questions are addressed only based on the guideline and the specific content that Northwestern has published, right? So these are the types of things that we're tackling in this first use case, right? It is Q&A, it is scheduling, right? And we try to keep it simple because we wanted to make sure that there was no we started with simplicity and then we wanted to get into more elaborate use cases. But these are the ones that people resonated with. Also, the other part of this is from a customer standpoint, while there is AI at play, this was like an open need, right? We saw that, look, we don't have to run into other players, and everyone seems to have this need. So anyway, this is a solution that is getting deployed. Our goal is to be an enterprise solution. And so because we've spent almost, I call it like a fellowship in radiology, we do understand the nuances of what it takes to do medical related AI, right? And so we understand that. Having said that, we were guided by our client to step back and do the patient-facing solution. Anyway, going forward from there, we are working with the same institution to do more concierge. When we showed our solution to the chief medical officer there, he basically said, Farooq, you've got one concierge, I've got 5 other ready to go. So let's get this done and let's go to the next ones, right? And so the point is there are many of these solutions, right, that will come into play. We intend to tackle them one by one. We have that experience because we've done it in radiology, and radiology is a pretty high bar. You cannot be wrong there, right? If you are writing a report and you're wrong, you could hurt somebody badly, right? And so we've been through that already. So that's why we understand the physician-facing concierge work that's going to come up. And finally, sort of the workforce concierge, there is plenty of opportunity to operationalize, to improve, to make sure, I don't see why billing should be as complicated, why it should take this long, why it should have any errors, right? And as an example, I made the comment to someone that, look, this is not really a technology challenge anymore. This is a business challenge. Like, who's going to take it on themselves to work with an AI company to truly nail this, right? And so that's kind of what we're working on with the same institution. So anyway, this is where we are. This is what we're going for. And then finally, my last slide is people would ask us, so, what are the key takeaways in this journey? Because, this is a 6-year journey and it's going, right? And we are angel funded. We've done, work with clients, and we're continuously sort of innovating and getting interest. But aside from the fact that you need to have the right use case, aside from the fact that you need to have the right ROI and make sure there's no hallucinations and you're avoiding all of those errors, the main takeaway for me as an entrepreneur here working in this space is that organizational alignment is key. And these are things that people talked about pre-AI days, right? So when you were selling data products or analytics products, that's what was brought up. The same theme has to be addressed here, because as an organization, if you have that corporate alignment, that, look, this is what we're going to implement corporate-wide, as opposed to individual departments going at their own research, you usually will not end up in an enterprise-wide solution. And so that's kind of the biggest learning lesson for us is start with the corporate level, have buy-in at the executive, and make sure they all understand and value it, and then start building these individual concierge or use cases or beachheads in the individual areas that make more sense. So with that, I apologize, I'm not going to do a demo, but happy to do it in any follow-up conversations. But feel free to reach out to us if needed, and I'll kind of stop here. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you, Farooq. And I want to remind you that with the 800 or so people that are here virtually, there's a lot more health systems than Northwestern that are here. So we're just the host, but open it up to others. Next up, we're going to see Sam Glassenberg has a company called Level EX, and they've been around for a while, but now they've taken and used generative AI to help them with medical training. So we're going to hear from him and I think see a demo of it as well.
Hi, everybody. All right, can we switch to the, all right, great. And here, let me get started. You know what, actually, I'm gonna switch my order of slides here real quick. Perfect, okay, just based on what we've heard. Okay, so, all right, and everything looks good on the video, right? I'll trust the IT guys. Okay, so the first thing I want to say is this is the AI solution showcase. It's supposed to be companies pitching you on their AI solutions. I have no AI solutions. I run a company called Level X. We make video games for medical training. I am. They're supposed to spotlight me. All right. Everybody stay tuned. As you can see, this is going to be very visual. All right, how's that? Got you covered, IT team. No problem. All right. So like I said, we don't make AI solutions. We make video games for medical training. So we have 1 million medical professionals across the world earning CME credit while they play video games that train them how to dose, treat, diagnose, perform surgery. If I'm going to sell anything, I mean, you can download them all for free in the App Store. Search for Level X in the App Store, and you can go do surgery on your phone. We do a lot of really cool things. In the course of doing this, basically what our company does is we are taking technology from the video games industry and we're unleashing it in healthcare. The video games industry, in many places, in many ways, is decades ahead of what is happening in healthcare. And so one of the things that we do, our mission is to basically bring that technology over. And as a result, the video games industry has been incredibly forward-thinking when it comes to generative AI, and we're bringing some of that over. So again, I have no solutions that I'm trying to sell you, but instead we have learned a great deal in the course of using generative AI for creating solutions for medical training. And I'm just here to share what we've learned. Hopefully it's helpful. And so there's a lot of questions that people keep asking about generative AI, like what does it mean for my job? What does it mean for us as employees? What does it mean for us as educators, as engineers? And there's an industry that has embraced generative AI wholeheartedly, and that's the video games industry that provides lessons both sort of promising and warning that are directly applicable to healthcare. So the video games industry has wholeheartedly embraced generative AI, and it provides us with a sort of model about how to think about it. Instead of viewing generative AI, so like a lot of industries are viewing generative AI as a threat, including in medicine. In the video games industry, they don't view it that way. Artists, engineers overwhelmingly view it as a healthy and welcome evolution of 3 decades of innovation. And I'll sort of explain why that is. So first, a little bit about me. I've spent my career before healthcare in the video games industry. I come from a family of doctors. My father was an anesthesiologist here at Northwestern for like 40 years. But my career, I'm the disgrace of the family. I spent my career at places like LucasArts, making Star Wars games, also Microsoft. I used to run the DirectX graphics team there. And the video games industry has become this exemplar for embracing Gen AI. And why is that? So my team's job at Microsoft was to figure out how to make video games look real. And so you can just watch year over year, we're able to take advantage of Moore's law to make video games that are increasingly more realistic. So when I joined Microsoft around the turn of the millennium, this is the best looking video game character that we had. And my team's job was to figure out how do we go from this to this. So today I can buy a copy of Call of Duty with 12 soldiers on screen and zoom into the eye of one of the characters on screen. And this is the level of detail which we're making video game characters in just $50. Go to Best Buy, enjoy, or just download them. So when you think about the video games industry, though, so we've been in this cycle where we continually have to deliver an order of magnitude more content at an order of magnitude more detail. But you can't make this using the tools that you were using 20 years ago, 10 years ago, 5 years ago. The example I give is, let's say we're in Chicago. I'm from Chicago, I live here. Let's say we're making Watch Dogs, and we need to recreate the entire city of Chicago, like down to the soda can on the ground. You cannot do that by hand, right? Building the city of Chicago by hand took 100 some years, right? You're not going to be able to do that by hand. You're not going to be doing that by drawing the buildings one by one. And so in the video games industry, what we've been doing is every year or every 5 years, you need to figure out how to make your same team of artists an order of magnitude more efficient. So any artist who's working in the video games industry, anything that they're doing today, they're expecting will be automated in 5 years. If you're doing the same thing today you were doing 5 years ago, something's wrong with you. And so, this is, so you start out by, we used to make video games by drawing things by hand. That wasn't fast enough. We came up with all these 3D modeling techniques, model with clay so we can rapidly produce characters and environments. Even that's not fast enough. You can't build a city that way. There we started moving into something called procedural tools, where we use math that's modeled off of the previous generation of tools. So an artist can just paint a street and it'll automatically fill in the buildings and the trees and everything else. And what we're starting to do is use those procedural tools, these sort of mathematical algorithmic tools, to train the next generation of tools, which is what we're using with generative AI. These same approaches, however, are also relevant in healthcare, and I'll show you what that looks like. So first we have this, so today, even sort of the last 5 years in video games, even longer, we've been creating these systems where artists can just draw things and it will generate, or turn dials, and it'll generate buildings and cities and so forth. Here's an example. This is Unreal Engine where you can create a forest and you'll just see the artist goes and grabs that island and moves it to the right. And the system automatically fills in the water and the rocks and the trees and everything to just make it look realistic. So this is an example. So we're using the same mathematical procedural techniques at level X for medical training to train doctors. So in this example, we have a mathematical model of, let's say, plaque psoriasis that allows an artist to basically turn dials with the guidance of a dermatologist and say, all right, make that crustier, make that redder, make it wetter in the crevices, change the shape, and literally you can just turn dials and it'll generate ultra realistic psoriasis using the same techniques we're using in games. The images just emerge from the model. So this is an example of last generation procedural techniques. And we use this to basically train doctors' brains how to recognize skin disease on skin of any color, and any severity, on any body part, on any skin tone, under any lighting environment. So we talk about things like bias in systems. These are examples of how you can use these technologies to actually overcome bias in the system by introducing better, more diverse training data, in this case, because we're training humans, how to recognize skin disease on skin of color. So again, none of this is real. All these images are just computer generated. We're using the same techniques, procedural techniques, to model body movement. So mathematical models that, let's say, allow artists to overlay a tremor at any frequency or at any amplitude on any body part to, let's say, train a neurologist how to recognize the difference between a Parkinsonian tremor and a TD tremor. So these are procedurally generated systems. They're mathematic, they're simulated. But what's interesting is we're now using this data, right, the data we've generated off the last generation procedural systems, to train our next gen AI systems. So this is what video game characters are going to start looking like next year. This is this completely computer generated character, but he's not even simulated. He's real time using an AI model that is trained off of physics data. And so these are some of the systems that we're starting to explore for doing virtual patient technology for next year. We are basically using Gen AI methods to create, better training data to train doctors. So you can create, ultra realistic patients in real time that behave because they're driven by generative AI systems that are trained on real physics. But this idea has much broader implications. So we can actually use last generation, like the procedural methods from last gen, to train synthetic data, to train smart AI systems. So this is a really pixelated video of our GastroX game. You can download it from the App Store. It simulates gastroenterology with fluids and physics and soft tissues. But since we're procedurally generating that image, we know exactly where everything is. We know the position of the camera, the tools, the lights, the anatomy. And so we can use that data to train smart AI systems that actually know where you are in the procedure, exactly what's happening, what is the pathology. And so just like how in games, we're using the last generation algorithmic procedural methods to train our content AI, you can use the same approach to train smart systems in healthcare. So instead of, let's say, tagging surgical videos as best as you can to try to generate training data for smart systems, now you can actually figure out what is the data that you want, the tags that you want, and generate it procedurally, and automatically generate, what it looks like under X-ray, under ultrasound, so we can train smarter, not just smarter, unbiased AI systems that know how to find cancer, interpret ultrasound, because we're able to generate synthetic data that gives us the breadth of input that we want, and we know exactly what's in that data. It's perfectly tagged. Which brings me sort of to the next I'll say overlooked R&D application of generative AI. So we're just going to hop around to different subjects. So there's this misperception that the value of Gen AI today in engineering is to sort of replace the engineering grunt work, right? Take that code that you were already planning to outsource to East Asia or Eastern Europe, and because it's the grunt work, and instead ChatGPT is going to do that for you. And that may be true, but it's actually less interesting. What we found is that what's more interesting about Gen AI is not replacing the bottom, the bottom tier engineers, but actually empowering the top decile engineers to solve some of the harder problems that you've tabled because they're so difficult. We found that you can solve those in orders of magnitude less time. Okay, I apologize in advance. I only have a few minutes, so I'm going to skip over all the technical detail. Happy to talk about this later. But essentially, we talk about realistic skin, for example. Simulating light bouncing around a scene is mathematically very, very compute intensive. But it's critical for complex materials like skin. You've held your hand up to a flashlight, it glows. The reason why old CG movies from 15 years ago, everything looked like plastic, is because they weren't simulating these effects we call like subsurface scattering, because they're computationally very intensive. Light comes into your skin, bounces around, comes out somewhere different. That's why skin looks waxy. And that's why only recently have we gotten realistic skin in movies and video games. In movies, you have 6 hours to basically generate every frame. But in video games and in surgical simulation, we have to generate 60 frames a second. So the problem becomes much harder. There are ways that you can, what I'll say, pre-compute a lot of this. So you can have a realistic simulation in your surgical simulation with shadows and reflections and realistic tissues, and it all moves around in real time. But these techniques are incredibly complex. One approach was actually developed by Microsoft Research. That seems to be the theme today. Back when I was at Microsoft, it's called pre-computed radiance transfer with spherical harmonics. I'm not going to try to explain it. The math behind it is essentially shared with quantum mechanics. At Level X, we wanted to integrate this technique into our games because it would allow us to make more realistic surgical games. But I estimated it would probably take our engineers at least 4 to 6 months to get this working. Then I tried with ChatGPT and got it up and running in a weekend. And what was interesting is it's almost comical, like, hey, ChatGPT, write code to rotate a 6th order spherical harmonic vector. ChatGPT goes, well, rotating a 2nd order spherical harmonic vector, that's very easy, but 6th order, well, that's a complex task that requires a deep understanding of spherical harmonics, and they're I don't care, ChatGPT, just do it. Well, fine. I mean, here's Sam, if you want, here's the math. Well, we need to calculate the Wigner D matrix for that. That's very complicated. I said, ChatGPT, you have a Mathematica plugin, just do it. Okay, here you go, right? And then boom, in a matter of hours, the whole thing is up and running on real patient data, generating shadows, subsurface scattering, inner reflections, all this stuff. Because ChatGPT has this incredibly interdisciplinary system that knows all of the quantum mechanics math. You just got to tease it a little bit. And then the weekend after, all right, next project, let's develop some new methods for simulating bone drilling that, can also run on a cell phone. So these are just, things to think about, right? What are some of the hard problems? It's not just about what are the easy problems I can farm out, right? What's the grunt work? What are the hard problems that we've been putting on the back burner because we're like, I don't know, it's going to be a big investment. You might work on it for a year and then not come up with anything and not solve it. Open those up again because ChatGPT might help. Completely next topic. Okay, so we also use ChatGPT to generate lots of training data for doctors. It's great. We can do all these combinatorics. It can actually fill out a lot of data. The results are mind-blowing, sometimes a little bit too much. And herein lies one of the problems with LLMs. We talked about hallucination. I'll show you really what that looks like in creating training content. So, all right, ChatGPT, Can you come up with a multiple choice question that combines cultural references with dermatology knowledge that a dermatologist would find intriguing and challenging? Sure. Which iconic singer was known for their distinctive mole on their face, which was actually a kind of benign tumor called a neurofibroma? Marilyn Monroe, Sheridan, these, wow, it's like deep dermatology knowledge and cultural references. Everything in red is medically incorrect. Woohoo! Highly believable, highly believable, but wrong. Why? Because ChatGPT is optimized for believability over accuracy. And you need to make sure that your editors know, like the same processes that you follow for peer review on any human-generated content need to be applied. But more importantly, the editor always needs to know that the content was AI generated. Because a human writer will, if they're not sure of something, they'll write less detail. If an LLM isn't sure of something, it'll add more detail. So a reviewer would be like, oh, a human writer writing this would never write in this level of detail if they knew what they were talking about. So clearly they're not going to make this up. I call this kind of like the chutzpah factor. Like ChatGPT will just like make it up. They'll make up references. It'll make up data to fill in that additional detail. So any reviewer needs to be deeply aware of this. This is the bigger problem in honing generative AI models. It's humans. Humans can tell what is believable much better than they can tell what is accurate. And this is why precise control over that input data set is so important. I haven't been talking to the mic this whole time. I hope people can hear me. I know you can hear me because I'm loud, but I don't know about the people on the thing. Okay. And so just like the video games industry learns its lessons from the film industry, there's a great deal that healthcare can learn from game development. How am I doing for time? Am I out of time? You got time?
You got the 9-minute mark.
Oh, because I have more. Okay, great. I have more examples. Want more examples? We can do. Okay, great. Okay, so one, I'm very, this is actually the biggest benefit of generative AI in healthcare. I am proud to finally announce the death of cheesy medical stock photography. Like all those, everyone knows what I'm talking about, right? Those like endless images of actors in white coats holding a stethoscope backwards, smiling, and you see the same ones on every website. And you're like, I saw that guy. He was a gastroenterologist in the last ad. He can't be a dermatologist. Yeah, that's gone now. There's no excuse for that crap because now your AI model can generate any image of any doctor doing anything under at any visual style, any lighting environment that you want, and it'll look right, and you can tweak it to do exactly what you need to do. So I don't want to see that actor again because there's no excuse. Well, I've got 9 minutes. All right, we got more examples. I think like another thing, so this is sort of going beyond what Level X is doing, but just one thing that I think is interesting. Now that you've seen how we have this ability to generate these ultra realistic characters using generative AI that are real-time interactive, I haven't shown, we've talked about LLMs that can generate text. What I haven't even showed you, you've probably seen it, is like you can recreate completely realistic voice and so forth. So I think like this is an interesting application. We're not working on this. Is using this to address some of the loneliness epidemic, right? Like if you imagine, the elderly patient who, has difficulty speaking, who, it's really hard to find somebody who has the patience to like listen to her and talk to her and engage with her. Like you could kind of solve that problem anyways. If she wants to like take her favorite character from a film, take Humphrey Bogart, whoever you want, like she can now talk to that person endlessly who, would like, as an LLM that with a realistic real-time face and a realistic voice that wants nothing more but to hear her stories about her children and grandchildren that she may have told 4 times in the in the last 2 days, but like that's okay, right? Now you can finally like that loneliness problem, at least you can take a pretty, I think, big bite out of it by suspending disbelief and allowing people to talk to somebody that they want to talk to who wants nothing else in the world but to listen to everything they have to say and engage them and bring positive energy into their lives. These are just sort of different examples of ways that sort of outside of the obvious, like take dictation in the clinic, of ways that you can apply these technologies. And we're doing some of this obviously in video games, but I think you can just literally take those technologies and applications and unleash them in healthcare. Oh, maybe here's another one. I wasn't expecting an extra 10 minutes, so I shortened my slide deck. So here's another one. So folks are familiar, I know like, folks are familiar with sort of how ChatGPT works under the hood. Where like there are no words in ChatGPT. ChatGPT, like there's no place in ChatGPT you can go and just like find a list of, like you talk to it and it's talking to you, but there's actually no place where it has a centralized just sort of list of words. Inside ChatGPT, everything is created as what we call word embeddings. Your ChatGPT is actually modeled after the human brain. It's a neural network. It's an artificial neural network. It's just, you know, I have some sort of content on this, but it's essentially, you know, it's just like a bunch of internet-connected nodes. The data moving through it is not words. The data moving through it are these vectors that represent words simply as representation, as relationships to other words. So the way you would represent the word, you know, this is a good example, like the way you would represent, you know, the word, you know, kingdom or palace or, you know, king would all just be a vector of the relationship of that word to every other word, right? It's actually just represented as a bunch of numbers that move through this artificial neural network that really represents the way, is modeled after the way the human brain works. And so I think like one interesting exercise that when I have enough free time I'll do is like you could actually take an LLM like ChatGPT and it'd be interesting to go in and just zero out a bunch of its artificial neurons. Like just go in and take ChatGPT. ChatGPT 3.5 has 1.7, what are the numbers? There's like a certain number of neural connections in these different systems. GPT-3, for example, has a million nodes that are then interconnected each layer by I think about 3 billion connections. GPT-4 is a little bit more than that. But basically what you could theoretically do is go through and just zero out a bunch of those connections and see, does ChatGPT start behaving like a patient with a stroke? And I think you'd start to actually develop, I think there's some interesting studies to be done. Now that we sort of have this model of how memory is embedded and word relationships are embedded, it really reflects the way things work in the human brain. I think it'd be an interesting exercise to go at ChatGPT and modify its neural network and see, are you able to recreate some of the same effects that you see in humans when their neural network is damaged by, you know, a blood clot or trauma and so forth. So, okay, I've now sort of bounced around enough random topics and we're coming up on time. So anyway, I'm Sam. We're constantly at Level X exploring new ways to utilize generative AI in medical training. Literally every few weeks, we're coming up with new techniques, new approaches, new obstacles, new gotchas, new ideas. I'm happy to keep sharing them. I post a lot about this online. So you can feel free to just, I think that will take you to something that lets you follow me on LinkedIn. So you can follow me on LinkedIn and just, you know, hear about all the crazy things that are happening at the intersection of video games, healthcare, and AI. Thank you very much. I'm just gonna take the spotlight.
And then we'll close that. Perfect. Thank you, Sam. If I only knew your talk ahead of time, I would have popped my Xanax and be ready for it. It was just it was a lightning journey. That was a compliment. Okay. Next up, this is going to be fun. I'm going to be a patient in representative of work that's being done by Nuance. And Dr. Pasha, an ER doctor, is joining us, who is going to demonstrate the use of the generative AI and in note-taking. So, Riz, I'm going to try, let's make sure that we can find a convenient place.
Hey, Sam, before we start, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
All right.
Oh, sure,
So
yes. I'm going to just move over there and sit there, and you'll just let me know when you're ready for me.
I will. So I'm going to just go through a few slides. We'll get it set up, and we'll go from there, okay? It'll be about 5 minutes, and we'll get started. But thank you, everybody.
He's generating the slides? Great.
Can you guys see my slides? Yes?
Not yet.
All right. Not yet. Hold on one second. I thought I was sharing my screen, but let me just make sure. Can you guys, okay, let me know if you can see my slides. I'm sharing my screen now. And can you see my slides?
Yes, we are good.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Durman. Thank you, Sam. That was very entertaining. So my name is Rizwan Pasha, and I'll walk you through this presentation about what exactly we're going to be talking about. So thank you again for the invite. I work at Microsoft. I'm an ER physician. I'm also one of the CMIOs at Nuance. So I'm a practicing emergency physician, and what I'm going to talk about is DAX Copilot, which is the ambient documentation tool that we have been working on for the last several years. And this is all very based on Dragon, which is a voice recognition tool that a lot of folks have been using. I've been a practicing ER physician for about 20 years, and burnout has been a big problem for a lot of providers in our space, especially when they're spending a lot of time doing administrative tasks like documentation. Dragon helped quite a bit, but still there was a lot of tasks being thrown on the providers. So what we set out to do was create an ambient tool, and we started on this journey about 6 years ago. And we created a tool where we had a human in the loop, where we had a supervised model that we were creating using an AI generated note with a recording, and then a human correcting every single note. We did that about 20 million times now. And every time we've been doing this, we've been perfecting this AI model. And then last year, when GPT-4 came along, we started adding in some of the generative AI tools on top of our model to create a note automatically within a few seconds. And that's what DAX Copilot is. So this is based on Dragon as a speech to text, and then an AI model takes those texts and then creates a note from the recording automatically. You can have multiple people in the room. You can have interruptions. You can start and stop the recording. You can talk about different topics that aren't related to medicine. And the AI model is smart enough to create a note for the provider. That's the first step. We're also doing other things with this, and it's not just in the ambulatory space anymore. It's also available now in the emergency room space. We have several users testing it now, and also in the inpatient space, we have users using it. Plus, we're also working with our EHR partners like Epic and other EHRs to embed this directly into the nursing workflow as well. So we have some early adopters that are testing this out now to do some flow sheet documentation for nurses. So I'm going to walk you through quickly a few slides, and then Dr. Durman and I are going to do a live demo where we're going to do a mock patient encounter and show you the output of what the AI does. You'll actually see what your doctor does and what it's doing for them in their electronic health record. So initially, we capture the voice and we create a note. We can also use vocal biomarkers to add on other abilities to this tool. And we create a note, and you'll see that now. But there's more to this platform than just the note creation. We're also extracting data from that note to help with other things that they have to do in their workflow. So as an example, putting orders in, putting in medications from the discussion that's being had and identifying them and putting them into the right spots, like the problem list. And also doing other things and then transforming this data for billing and coding information, helping with discharge planning. So some of these things, those are parts of the platform that we're extracting data from that Harjinder talked about in the very beginning. But this is what the platform is set up to do. So what we're going to focus on is DAX, which stands for Dragon Ambient Experience. And for Star Trek fans, it's also a character in Star Trek. But basically what it does, it allows you to record the conversation on your phone. And we've embedded this in Epic as an example. And we're already deployed this at Northwestern, where this is embedded in the Epic's app for Haiku, which is, you'll see some screenshots of that today. But basically, you start the recording on Haiku, you select the patient, you start the recording, and you put the phone down. You have a normal conversation with the patient, you talk about other stuff, you talk about their car, about the weather, you talk about maybe another family member in the room, maybe you get interrupted, you stop the conversation, and you start it again. And then when you stop the conversation, finally, it takes all that audio, loads up to the cloud, creates a note, and sends it into Epic or your electronic health record immediately, and you can see it before the patient even walks out of the room. Okay, it's not perfect. It does make some mistakes sometimes. It doesn't always. The demos don't always work perfectly, so we'll walk you through it and show that to you today how it works. We support every single specialty in ambulatory medicine now. We have users using this in emergency medicine and inpatient, as I already alluded to earlier. We'll be rolling those out officially in the next few months. We're also working on other things like orders and other things within. And the reason people are deploying this, a problem we're trying to solve is we're trying to help the physicians with burnout and efficiency. So physicians spend 40 to 50% of their time doing other things besides patient care. They like seeing patients. They like spending time with patients. That's why they went to medical school or are working in hospitals. But they still have to do the business of medicine, which they have to document so they can get compensated. They also have to, and patients don't love it when physicians are sitting there typing or putting stuff in their EHR. And physicians don't love taking stuff home and spending 2 hours documenting. So this tool is squarely aimed at solving that kind of a problem. And we've measured this now. Physicians are saving time, their satisfaction is going up quite a bit. And patients, we've also measured these metrics, by the way, from different patients. The patients like it better because the physician is more engaged. They're looking at them in the eye, they're thinking of the problem at hand, not worried about remembering all the details of the documentation. And the note quality gets better because often, if you don't know this, physicians don't all do their notes at the same time they see you. They take a few notes, then they batch up their documentation. They do it at the end of the day or when they get a break. And by that time, when they start documenting, they've probably forgotten 30 to 40% of the details that happened in that encounter. So that's why this is a tool that's really resonating for a lot of folks. I'm going to go through these slides very quickly, but basically you start on, you look at the patient schedule on the iPhone app on your EHR. You click on the patient's name, and when you click on the patient's name, you see the record on the right-hand side, and there's a button for DAX built in already. You click on that, and you see a microphone icon, and you start the recording, and you put the phone down. You talk to the patient like Dr. Derm and I will do in a second. And you have a conversation. You go back and forth, and if you hit the microphone button again on that phone, it stops the recording, and you get a notification on your patient's chart that the note's ready. It takes about 5 seconds for that to happen. Sometimes a little bit longer, depending on how long the note is, but generally 4 to 5 seconds. And then when you open the note is already sitting in these sections, these smart sections within your electronic health record. They're already organized into the different areas, labeled, organized, and also the problems are identified. And you can add stuff as you go along. So that's pretty much it. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to ask Dr. Derman to come up. And Dr. Derman, I'm going to call you Daniel, if that's okay. And I'm also going to mirror my phone. So when you're ready,
no
if you want
problem.
to come to the podium.
And I'm going to try sitting in the chair. I usually have a loud voice. If this works, you'll let me know.
Yeah,
if not, I'll. Is that
no,
if you're not?
That's good. I can see it. That's perfect.
Okay.
I can see you now.
And if the voice is not good, I'll move over to the podium. But we'll assume that it works fine like this.
Yeah, I can hear you fine. So you're good. All right. So what you're seeing here I'm going to maximize this. So I just mirrored my phone. So I'm just holding up my phone to the camera so you can see it. But basically what I'm doing is I've just mirrored my phone onto the screen, and I'm going to find the DAX application. I'm going to hit the microphone button, and let's pretend I'm using your electronic health. I'm going to magnify this so you can see this. There's a consent process for the patient. Patients are consented. 99% of patients consented because they recognize this is going to be helpful. So Dan, I'm going to walk in the room, introduce myself. We'll get started, okay? And
Sure.
What are you coming in for today? Just remind me, are you coming in for chest pain or something else?
Yes. Bizarre for me, bizarre and really never experienced before. Some very substantial chest pain.
All right, cool. So I'm walking in the room. I've reviewed your chart. I'm walking in. I'm going to pretend you're 55. I'm going to pretend you've got diabetes and also COPD, and you've got this knee chest pain. Okay, and we'll go through it. Hey Dan, I'm Dr. Pasha. Good to see you today. I'm sorry you're having some chest pain. I know you saw DAX when you checked in. Is it okay if I turn on my recording so I can get my notes done?
Absolutely. I'm fascinated by technology, so go for it.
Cool. So I just turned this thing on. It's listening already, which is interesting, and I can talk about other things, and it doesn't put this in. So Dan is a 55-year-old male who presents today complaining of chest pain and also has a history of diabetes and COPD. So Dan, tell me about this chest pain. What happened?
Well, all of a sudden, 2 nights ago, I woke up in the middle of the night and I just had this, I'm afraid to use the word crushing, but it really was like a very severe chest pain that was on the front of my chest area, really on both sides of what I think you'd call the breastbone.
Okay. And how long did it last? You still have it, or is it gone now?
No, it got worse at night when I was moving around in bed, but even when I got up in the morning and moved around, it was still there.
Okay. Anything make it better or worse?
You know, I wasn't sure what it was. I took 2 Aleve, and I have a sense that maybe it's better after taking the couple of leaves.
Okay. Now, were you doing anything strenuous, or were you lifting anything or moving something, or did anything that may have caused it, or just kind of came in all of a sudden on its own?
You know, my partner asked me the same thing, and I was kind of racking my brain. And today's Thursday. On Sunday, the only thing I could think of was, actually, no, I'm sorry. This was on Monday. I decided to wax my car. Don't ask me why. I got this crazy idea that I'm going to wax my car.
Wow.
And I went out and I bought this wax. If you remember those commercials that talked about Carnauba wax?
Yeah.
I went out and I bought Carnauba wax, and I applied it on my car. And my car looked like a commercial. It was perfectly white with all the Carnauba wax on it. Then I went to try to polish the Carnauba wax off. And if you remember those commercials, it says Carnauba wax is the hardest wax in the world.
Yeah.
I started pushing the wax and nothing happened at all.
Wow. Okay.
3 hours later, after pressing on it and everything, the car was finally clean. There were some little stripes of white, but I got the car done. That is really the only thing I could think of. And the pain did not start right after I did that.
Yeah.
But interestingly enough, did start in the middle of the night that night. So if I did it on Monday, between Monday and Tuesday, I woke up at 3 a.m. with this chest pain on both sides of my breastbone.
Got it. And what kind of car do you have, by the way? I mean, that's
it's a 65 convertible Mustang.
Oh, wow.
Red.
That's
it
beautiful.
is gorgeous.
That's awesome. Well, it's good to know. Well, let me ask you a little bit more about this chest pain. Does this chest pain go to your jaw or back or anything like that, or does it radiate anywhere?
No, it doesn't. It just stays right smack in the middle of my chest. Sometimes it's more on the left side, sometimes more on the right side. I do think that when I put my hand over my head, that maybe that makes it a little bit worse.
Okay. And all right, got it. And I looked at your EKG before I came in today. They got the EKG and you complained of the chest pain. The EKG on my review looks normal. I don't see any ST segment changes, no signs of a heart attack, so that's good. So
thank God.
Is it worse when I press on your chest? Is it worse if I press on your? Let me examine your chest. Is it hurt?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
That's
So
it right there. You got it, bud.
Okay. So an examination, it's tenderness to palpation on the anterior chest over the sternum. Okay, got it. And how about if I'm going to take a listen to your breathing for a second. Take a deep breath. Okay. So your lungs are clear.
I'm sorry.
It hurts
for your own notice. When I'm taking a breath, when I'm sort of at the end of taking a deep breath in, that hurts more.
Okay, so it is a little bit worse when you take a deep breath. Okay, so lungs are clear, though I don't hear any wheezing, no rales, no bronchi. Okay, good. So, well, I'm sorry to hear. It sounds like it's muscular pain. What I'm going to do is, I still want to do some blood work and check your cardiac enzymes and make sure those are okay. Your EKG looks good. I think this is muscular. I don't hear anything on the lungs right now, so I don't think we need a chest X-ray or anything like that. I think this is all muscular. It should get better, but I do want to do you smoke, by the way? Ever smoked?
I quit 12 years ago. Have not touched a cigarette since then. By the way, I know you're the doctor, but I do want to add that since I have no idea what this was, I tried popping some Pepsid AC because I thought maybe this was heartburn, and it didn't do squat for me.
Okay, got it. And all right. Anybody in your family have a history of heart disease or heart attack at a young age?
Well, I have diabetes, and my father had diabetes, and he had a stent put in at age 62, and he lived till 78 when he had a massive stroke, and died, unfortunately.
Okay. All right. That's helpful. Thank you for sharing that. All right. Well, let me, since you mentioned the diabetes, can we talk a little bit about that? I haven't seen you in a while. So how's your blood sugar been at home? I know we checked your hemoglobin A1C last time. It was 7.2. I'm looking at your old note here in Epic, and we were talking about improving your diet and exercise. How's that going?
Not bad. It is, we're talking early February. So we went through the holidays, and I have to admit, between the end of the year and after the first of the year and Michigan going to the championship game, I did have some dietary indiscretions, but I got back on the bandwagon about 2 weeks ago.
Yeah, and the Super Bowl is coming up this weekend. So do you have any big plans for the Super Bowl?
Wings. What else?
Okay. Well, that's not great for your diabetes, but we'll check it. We'll check your hemoglobin A1C again today, and if we need to make any adjustments, I'll send you a note in my chart. Okay. How's the breathing been with your COPD? Any issues there? Coughing, shortness of breath, wheezing, much?
Not bad. Not bad.
Okay.
When we had that cold snap at the beginning, in the middle of January, it was a little tough for me. I tried to stay indoors, but once the weather got back up over freezing, it's been pretty okay.
Okay, cool. Excellent. Well, let me examine you for a second. I already did your heart and lungs. Is your belly hurting any place? Are you tender and you're going to examine your belly?
No.
Okay, no abdominal tenderness, no guarding, no peritoneal signs?
Nope.
I'm using some medical lingo. If you don't understand any of the terminology, just ask and I can explain. I'm using it so it gets recorded and goes into my note automatically. I'm looking at your extremities and there's no calf tenderness, no negative Homan sign, no pedal edema. The rest of your exam looks pretty normal. Okay, so let's kind of summarize. For the chest pain, I think this is muscular chest pain. I'm going to recommend, I'm going to go ahead and get a cardiac enzymes, which are some blood tests we'll draw today to make sure there's no heart damage. Your EKG looks normal. And since you've been having this chest pain, I do want you to also see, I'm going to refer you to cardiology just to have a second look, especially considering your risk factors of your family history, your smoking history, and also the fact that you're diabetic. So I want them to take a look and see if they want to do a stress test or some other testing on top of that. Okay. If the chest pain gets
I'd feel
worse,
a lot
call me.
better. I'd feel a lot better about that. I know you're the doctor, and it sounds like you call it musculoskeletal, but better safe than sorry. So I appreciate you doing that.
Yep, no problem. And for the diabetes, let's go ahead and order another hemoglobin A1C today. Try to stay away from the wings and fatty foods and processed sugars if you can. I know in certain, especially the Super Bowl, it's hard. But we'll check that. Continue with the metformin right now. We'll see how that's doing. And then and for the COPD, you're pretty stable, so continue with that with your current regimen. Do you need a refill for your albuterol or Atrovent? Are you good?
No, I got 2 refills left. That's what on my app Walgreens told me. And for the diet, I promise, STM, start diet Monday.
Okay, got it. And for the last thing, for the health maintenance, I'm looking at Epic and you're behind on your tetanus. It's been a while. So if you're up to it, we can update it today that you're in the office today. We can go ahead and update that today for you.
Sure, happy to.
All right, sounds good. And why don't I have you follow up in about 2 weeks, and then we can follow up on some of these test results. Plus, we'll probably have you hopefully seen by cardiology by then as well. Okay.
Good. And are they going to get a hold of me for the cardiology appointment, or are you going to give me a number? How are we going to do that?
Yeah, we're going to send a referral. They'll contact you, schedule, and we'll contact you to get you into the clinic. Okay.
Good. Well, if it's at Northwestern, it'll be 6 months.
All right, sounds good. Well, thanks for coming in, Daniel. Good to see you. So thank you for playing, Dr. Derman, for that patient mock encounter. So what's happening is that audio now is being loaded up to the cloud. We kind of went back and forth. I did my exam in the middle. It's processing that audio, and within a few seconds, it should come back with a note. We also have the transcript of the entire conversation. So then now the note is done. I'm going to show you this other tab here first. There's a transcript right here. And you can see, the whole conversation, who said what is already there. We process all of that and then create this note. I'm going to scroll this slowly so you guys can see this and read it yourself. All right. So got the chest pains, worse at night, worse pain was moving in bed. He took 2 leave. It got that. He said wax his car. It got whack his car. I hope we weren't whacking your car too much, but otherwise it got everything else correct. It got the Carnivovax. and it got all that information. It radiates, does not radiate, stays in the middle of his chest. Sometimes it's more on the left side. Worse at night. He took Pepsid. It got all that information. It ignored all the information about the Super Bowl, the wings that we talked about. Denies any coughing, shortness of breath. He got the fact that he got quit smoking 12 years ago. He got the family history and all that information and put it in the right sections. It got the fact that I did my exam. If you notice, I did my exam in different parts. I did the first part of the exam, then I broke it up and I went back to do the other part of the exam. I got all that information. I reviewed the EKG with the patient, got my plan. So this note, I would say, is probably 95% accurate. I would probably change a couple things, but it still saves me a huge amount of time, right? If I had to dictate this, it would be another 7 to 10 minutes to make up this note, right, after the patient left. So this would be sitting in my electronic health record. I would not have to actually do anything else. It would actually, the view that I would be seeing, I'm going to change my screen here a little bit and show you, is I would be seeing that note sitting in my electronic health record already. And if I do any edits in these in my electronic health record, those edits are sent back to the AI engine at Microsoft to retrain the AI. So that it's a continually learning model, and we're continually improving it. Every few weeks, we update the model and we send an update, and it happens automatically because it's happening all in the cloud. And then our plan is not just to do kind of just in the ambulatory environment. We're obviously going through entire other parts of the hospital care settings, and also we're doing other things like natural language editing. I know we're running out of time, so I'm going to stop here pretty soon. But natural language editing allows you to naturally say, hey, take the description about the Carnuba vax and remove that and change it to the spelling. Just say it naturally, and it will do that. Or and then extract orders and then put them directly into the electronic health record so they're ready for the provider to just review and sign. So all of these notes, all of this is a co-pilot. So none of the note is automatic. The note is available to the physician. It's not signed. They read it, and then they correct any mistakes or anything, any errors, and then they sign it. So that's why it's high value, low risk, because the provider is still verifying everything before, and they just did the encounter, so it's right there within a few seconds. So it's really valuable to the providers. And also we can see we're working on Spanish encounters and other things. And I'm going to quickly stop, but what really matters for the provider is the accuracy, how good it is, how well trained the model is, and does it hallucinate? So this model is slightly different. It's not based on a large language model. This is a custom model that's been trained on real clinical data for about 20 million patient encounters. So the model does a really good job. It has low hallucination rate. The turnaround time, because it's a smaller model, it's very efficient. So it turns it around within a few seconds. And also, it's fully integrated into the electronic health record. So that's the other value for the providers, that they're not going into a separate app. They already use Epic every single day. It's right there in Epic. They're using all the Epic tools. It's already embedded in Epic, so they're not having to do something different than what they're used to. But anyway, thank you for inviting me for this conversation. Happy to, hopefully that was helpful and enjoyable for the audience, but I'll stop talking because I know we're over time.
Great. Riz, thank you very much. Very much. So we're going to give everybody a 10-minute break, and then we're going to come back for our panel discussion and wrap up. So for those live in the room, we have refreshments and some nibbles. And for those on the phone, on the video, you can use a bathroom break and go into your own fridge. As we get started, one more footnote on that DAX. So here, we were excited to present it because we've piloted it with 50 physicians over the course of the last 4 or 5 months, and it has just been wonderful. In fact, my team is going to our committee in 2 weeks' time to get final approval to roll it out across the healthcare system as well. And we have doctors now that said, you cannot take that away from us. Okay, well, welcome back, everybody. We're going to end this afternoon's conference with a panel discussion and a QA. And we have 3 distinguished folks joining us. Let's go at the end. At the far end here to my right is Dr. Abel Coe. Abel is the director of the AI in Medicine Institute at Feinberg School of Medicine, Northwestern University. Next to him, right immediately to his left, is internal medicine colleague of mine, Dr. David Leibowitz, who's the Associate Vice Chair for Clinical Informatics in the Department of Medicine here at the Feinberg School of Medicine. And finally, to his left is Crystal Tyler, PhD and MPH. She is the Chief Health Officer for Rhia Ventures, which specializes and cones down on women's health-related issues and topics. Perfect. So with that in mind, we saved the introductions. I did that so that we can move along and ask the questions. So first of all, to everyone, I did the introduction so we can save ourselves from that. But if you could at least just quickly talk about, I'll use the phrase, your relationship with generative AI, or if I woke you up at 3 in the morning and said, how does generative AI play a role in your life, professional life, please let us know. So why don't we start with you, Chris?
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Can y'all hear me okay? Yeah. Okay, again, Crystal Tyler, she, her pronouns, Chief Health Officer at Rhia Ventures. I am excited to be here. I have a unique relationship with AI, I'd say, compared to my colleagues here on the panel. So at Rhia Ventures, we really utilize the power of capital to advance health equity and racial equity, particularly in the area of women's health. And so as part of that, we have a venture capital organization that we partner with called RH Capital, and they invest in women's health technologies and could invest, although we have not to date, could invest in technologies that use generative AI. The things we look for when making investments in technologies, new innovation, are technologies that advance health equity. And we specifically are interested in things that are innovative, improve diagnostics and therapeutics, things that advance access to care, affordability of care, and that advance systemic change in the healthcare system, because we know that the healthcare system is not always equitable and outcomes don't always work for all of us. So in terms of our relationship, we really screen technologies that may use generative AI for potential investments. And I'm happy to talk a little bit more about that later.
Great, David.
Yeah, thank you so much. Hello, everyone. I'm David Leibowitz. So I'm an internal medicine physician. But a little bit of my connection to generative AI is way back a number of years ago, I studied electrical and computer engineering. And so I've kept up with a little bit of programming along the way. And a few years ago, really started honing some Python skills. And then lo and behold, I've been teaching digital health data science related topics and informatics for many years to medical students. But then came along the large language model APIs, which, if one knows how to do some programming with Python, makes it pretty easy to start creating all sorts of fun apps. So whereas some people have fun doing needlepoint and making some neat pillows and other things, I've been doing some of the coding at night and creating a variety of apps illustrating lots of different use cases within medicine and addressing some of the hallucination, other sorts of things that we've heard earlier, and kind of deploying this for our medical student and other trainee use at Northwestern.
Abel?
Yeah, sure. I'm Abel Coe. I'm also an internist in the same practice. Relationship status is we're dating and we're moving towards a very long-term relationship. So on the clinical side, both David and I are part of the pilot, the DAX pilot you just saw. And I can vouch for what Dan has said. Actually, it's been pretty impressive. It is something. I think the team here also, Anu, and has been really helpful in implementing in the clinic, and it does work rather impressively from a time-saving standpoint. My other task, though, my other hat is operating an institute that focuses on trying to advance the science of this. So we have a lot of researchers actively working on methods to improve the underpinnings of AI. My own personal passion is around how do these methods help enable other people's research and successful research. And so the underpinning, I think, of a lot of AI, which is up here, I think what I find most compelling is the underpinning. Like, how does it actually help sort of improve things like data quality and consistency? That part is a part that we're really focused on a lot, and that's the part that we're exploring the most.
Great, thank you. And for efficiency's sake, I'm going to stick with you, Abel. for the first question from the reporters pool. Tell us one area of AI application in healthcare that might not be obvious use case for Gen AI that you think is really cool.
Well, I'm the wrong guy to ask what's cool, but I will say what I personally am really excited about is people oftentimes see new technologies and they see all these really great applications on top. But the part that I get most excited about is the ability to sort of make sense, again, of the underpinnings. So you get back to the basics. And a lot of these models ultimately depend on high quality data. Sometimes it has to be well annotated. And the ability to take these raw sources and then convert them into something that's a little more consistent, understand sort of the provenance of it, the bias in there, that part is very, very compelling. I think that personally is the coolest thing you can do. It's kind of like, do you want to go dig for the gold, or do you want to make the tools that allow you to dig for the gold? And I feel like that other section, that layer is really the interesting section right now.
So let me ask a follow-up question to that, because in Harjinder's talk, they mentioned this idea of, I mentioned the idea, I was half in jest about Rumsfeld, but I guess one of my observations, what concerns me, is this idea of what we don't know. So I guess, and what I'm uncomfortable with is the pathway to get from where we're at now that has a lot of unknowns to better clarity. And statements such as, human in the loop will do the editing of it and that's going to fix it, scares the heck out of me, really, because it becomes user dependent. I guess you could say that's what we're always dependent on. But what do you think that pathway looks like from V1.0, where we're at now, where we get a lot of clarity and don't have to worry? Or are we always going to have to worry?
Well, I mean, the applications are so exciting right now. We're sort of enamored with that. But the point about what we don't know is really, really key. Right now, it's kind of like training a kid. You're teaching them with these basic textbooks, but it's not until you get out in the real world and there's all this diversity and complexity that they really you start seeing sort of the pitfalls and some of the complexities involved in this technology. I do think the tools themselves are actually potentially able to understand sort of what sort of section of the world you're actually seeing. And where necessary, you can even maybe create estimates of what and how to adjust your analysis based on what segment of that world you're seeing. So I do think that while there's limitations because of what we're feeding it today, there is the potential and the methods to try to understand that deficit and adjust for that.
David, you want to take a stab at that as well? I know you think a lot about this.
Sure. Thanks, Daniel. There are a variety of things that excite me that may not have been fully realized. I think some were hinted at a little bit in some of the presentations earlier too, although not necessarily commonly used when we're doing some of the chats. So one of the examples, kind of to then build in the healthcare context a little bit in this direction, that I created in an app was for our medical students when they're interviewing for residency training. And so I created both a hard and an easy interviewer for them. And it's actually with voice recognition as well. So they can talk back and forth with us. And this is going to continue to evolve much more extensively. And I've gotten some great feedback from students how they've been actually finding this sort of too helpful. So then apply this in a healthcare context. One could say we are not even close to the Jiffy Lube level of care in healthcare yet. So where people get reminders for their oil changes, we're doing a little bit of that, but not consistently. We have patients with a variety of complex chronic conditions. If they don't show up for that appointment, maybe someone will call them, but it's not consistent. We just hope they come in. Lots of opportunities here. So here, we all of a sudden no longer should have workforce limitations. And in fact, the people who are most remote from using technology often still have a phone, even if they don't have Wi-Fi internet access and they don't have a computer, and they could actually get calls to check on how they're doing. And by the way, the AI agent calling, in theory, would remember, oh, hey, Mrs. Jones, last time we chatted, you had just been in your garden. How's that coming, by the way? And, I'm calling now to check on this. And so it could actually keep those threads intact. So I think there's lots of use cases extending the workforce for things that we've never done and just, we can't do this. that we should be able to do so much better.
Yeah, we're happy to be looking at a really cool company called, many of you have probably heard of Hippocratic Care, which looks at, in the use case we're looking here at Northwestern, would be using the generative AI to make the outbound calls for prep for colonoscopies, exactly along the lines what you're talking about. And as opposed to a live rep, this rep can actually talk, if the person wants to talk for a half hour and talk about their garden and everything else, that person, that generative AI is more than happy to listen to it for a half hour, as along the way there's getting them all the information they need for the colonoscopy.
Remembers for the next time they call about something else. Exactly.
Perfect. Crystal, to you. As you look at new technologies and think about it, what do you look at in terms of use cases? How do you evaluate that? And a corollary question is, you said you haven't yet made an investment, but I'm sure you're looking at stuff. And so how are you thinking about that? And what's your guys' approach to that?
Sure. And I'll say I'm with Rhia Ventures. I'm not an investor myself. I'm an epidemiologist by training. I partner with our investment team to evaluate the potential impact of investments. So I have very close investment venture capital colleagues with RH Capital, and then I again evaluate the potential impact for those investments before investments are made. So in terms of what we look at, I mentioned our impact pillars: transformative innovation, access, affordability, and then systemic change. And we really look at that across a number of areas. And we don't necessarily say that a potential investment, a digital solution or a therapeutic solution, needs to peak or spike on all of these areas. They don't have to do everything, but they do need to spike on at least one, and they need to have an equity in mind. So if I were evaluating a potential AI solution for our portfolio, the things that I would want to know is, where are the data sources coming from? What type of data are you using for this particular tool? And what we know from just general research and context is that, historically speaking, data are incomplete when it comes to women, for example. Women weren't even required to be included in clinical trials until very recently. So from that perspective, if this particular solution is making recommendations, diagnostic or treatment recommendations, but the data that it's including don't represent the populations that it would serve, that would be screened out. Another example would be, what's the diversity of the data that you're including? There are a number of health outcomes where the data for certain racial and ethnic populations are incomplete, or because certain populations don't receive this particular type of care, cardiac, catheterization, things like this, a particular AI tool might recommend that that's not an appropriate treatment for that patient. When in reality, the data are incomplete. We don't have enough data to show us what really this particular patient needs. So when we're screening a potential investment, we want to know where your data are coming from. Tell me about those clinical trials. Tell me about your plan to make sure that it's inclusive and it represents the populations that we want to see treated. We don't want anything that's going to exacerbate inequities that are prevalent in the healthcare system.
So I'm not a researcher, and at the risk of showing my ignorance, go one step below that for me, because I've heard this for years, and I sort of accept as gospel that you have to make sure that the data sets you use are rich and inclusive. For those of us that don't do it, what smells like a rat to you when something isn't inclusive?
It's so easy to sniff out. It's like when you walk into a house and it smells like, what does it smell like when there's gas in the house? You don't know what it smells like until you smell it, and it's like, gosh, well, clearly. That's, to me, what it is. So one thing I'll say is, if I say, you have clinical trial data here, have you stratified your data? 8 times out of 10, no, we actually haven't stratified it at all by anything, not a single thing. So that would be a red flag. What did we say it smells like when there's gas in the house? Is it
rotten eggs?
Rotten eggs. That smells like rotten eggs to me if you haven't even stratified your data. If we say, tell me about the population that you use to create this particular data set, and they say, well, we've got a really great population in rural Arkansas with this one particular site, that's fantastic for that population, but how does that impact the general US population, for example? Another thing I'll say, and I think recently in 2023, federal laws changed. There are now a number of additional requirements when it comes to clinical trials, but the impacts of those changes aren't going to be seen across the field for a number of years. So I think as we're evaluating technology, especially when clinical trials were done under times when you didn't really need to be super inclusive, it's going to be a higher barrier, a higher burden for inclusion because, you know, the policies weren't there to require these things.
Abel, I saw you shaking your head yes multiple times during Crystal's. Anything else you want to add to that?
No, I'm so glad. I didn't realize your background was epidemiology. I love that.
I am an epidemiologist.
Because epidemiologists always emphasize the denominator. Like, who are you drawing from? And I think that is so important. So much of medicine and how clinical trials have been run, you know, historically, has been skewed. So even if you think about, like, not only for trials, but also even after they go out in the real world, like if you want to monitor the safety of a drug, people use the adverse event reporting system, you know, and that's a voluntary thing. So people report things out. But what that means is that we oftentimes don't pick up signals on these adverse events till many, many years later. And again, when it's across the whole population, we can know that ahead of time. You can know who's receiving medication. You can know how representative they are of a population. So, you know, these tools can help with that. One thing I would say, though, is that as a researcher, what we do see is that as you start getting more and more narrow in your question, you can sometimes get to a place very quickly where you have inadequate data anywhere. Like, there just simply is not the number of people that have a condition that you can cut X number of ways to get a statistically significant result from a study. And in those instances, there is a potential for technologies like this to generate either synthetic controls or other types of cases where there simply is not the number of this type of multiple cuts anywhere in the world. And I think we will start seeing some of that happening, again, from a Gen AI standpoint. That will likely start happening as well.
Can I add something?
Sure.
And I appreciate you mentioning that. I think it's such an important point to make. And as an epi person, especially someone who loves big data, I love the possibilities when it comes to imputation and things like that. I also would say, just as a point of concern, we've seen it's as recently as like a couple of years ago, instances where certain populations, clinical trial studies are done. There aren't quite the sample size to calculate population-specific rates, and we have treatments, therapeutics that come out and they do not work in the same way for some of these specific groups. And so I would say I think it's great to impute missing data, especially if it's missing at random, but if it's missing not at random, that's not going to work.
Good point. Thank you.
David, how can interdisciplinary collaboration between clinicians, data scientists, and ethicists shape the development and implementation of generative AI in healthcare to ensure that it meets clinical needs while upholding ethical standards?
Yeah, I think this is really important for a variety of the topics we were just hinting at as well. And I think, you know, I'll just give, this could be an incredibly long answer. I'll just give one quick perspective on this. And one might be, and I'll take it from even one of the app design perspectives. So one of the apps that I've created generates notes, sample notes for patients with different conditions, but it also gives the ability to introduce bias, the clinician bias when authoring the notes. Then I have another large language model that's attuned specifically with examples to look for any examples of bias in a note, and then to come up with a better way of expressing that same concept to then come up with a final note. So I have this kind of running loop. So to get at this question of having the right people involved at the table and being represented, part of our solutions need to essentially embody these aspects of what we feel is best practice in 2024 and going forward to ensure we have adequate representation in all the different data sets if we're drawing conclusions in that fashion, or to call it out when that's not present. And that particular agent, that is the single-minded goal of that particular agent, to do that sort of work with examples that it learns from to actually go ahead and execute in that way. So that's one way, just to give a specific example, but I think there needs to be convening, and those agents need to be drawn back and essentially under the supervision of the real experts in that area, so that they're confident that those agents are representing their perspectives when you have a combined output of these sorts of models that are interacting with clinical care settings.
Abel, would you say that generative AI is worth the hype?
Well, we're obviously entering a long-term relationship. So yeah, I think we think it's definitely something that
Bring the
is
mic
really-
closer.
Sorry,
to your,
it definitely is different than what we've seen before in the past. I mean, so historically, many of us had been involved with like traditional natural language processing and methods that sort of were precursors of Gen AI. And then 2 years, 3 years ago, it really just took this tremendous jump forward. And so now you're able to process notes with obviously a lot more compute power in ways that we never thought was possible. So it absolutely has this tremendous potential. But as we've heard just today, if anything, it underscores the necessity for getting the basics right. And so in addition to the provenance issues, the bias issues, there are like fundamentals about how we attribute data, how do we assign value to people who contributed that data, the privacy of that data. Those are other key considerations. So the basics have got to be right if we're going to really realize the full value of this, not get too ahead of our skis.
let me ask you, the two physicians on the panel, be our Sherpas for us. And if you had people at your knees learning for how to start down the journey and to use it, whether we're clinicians or whether we're at home, what would your recommendations be to get in the game?
Again, I do think like basic data literacy is really important. So David is leading a group that does a lot of work on education. Mahesh is here as well. He's also been doing a lot of work on trying to transform the medical school curriculum. And I think that we've come to realize that, there's different ways you need to engage healthcare providers. Many people are in healthcare because they want to provide healthcare. And so do we want them to all become technical experts coding? No. But do we want them to understand the basic underpinnings of the potential and the challenges of the technology, some of the ethical issues? Yes. So I do think that while we don't need to train everyone to be like an AI expert, we do need to make them literate in some of the terms and some of the underpinnings. That's probably the right place to start.
David?
I'll just jump that there are platforms now which have minimal or lower code requirements for actually cranking out some pretty impressive things. So in fact, even to create an app on the Apple iOS store, for example, one can know very modest coding and be able, so the hurdle isn't that great, and be able to kind of get an app out there that has some focused features. In the large language model domain specifically, I've created some, or leveraging some tools that allow one to have kind of what you see is what you get sort of programming, so you can experiment with models. And we're actually going to have a session for our medical educators here coming up later this month, kind of showing how that tool works with an eye that they're not coders, but if they're given kind of the templates already populated, they can tweak it, do some prompt engineering, see the app and how it works and make modifications to get an idea of how these things work. So that's one way to kind of get more familiar and see both all the pitfalls as well as when it actually can work as one really would like it to do.
Let me go off script for a minute and ask you what's a guardrails question. Are any of you familiar with, participating, or have a point of view about governmental's role in regulating this? We all know and believe that they're far behind in this. How do we bring them on board and continue to be able to innovate and move forward?
Sure. So we all agree that they're a little behind and they need to bring it on up to the, I don't know, to a couple decades. Like, let's move this along. And I'm a former Fed. I got my start at CDC as an epidemiologist, so I don't want to speak too badly about my federal colleagues. But I would say, the government does need to get it together. We need some additional regulations because this isn't regulated in a way that makes sense. In terms of data privacy, in terms of use of data, it's just not where it should be. We also know that these things take decades and years. And so I'm not terribly optimistic that there will be something in place by the time my daughter goes off to college. I will say, though, that others of us in this space have a responsibility, and we have tools in our disposal to actually do that. As someone who works in the investor space, I have power over capital. a lot of new technologies need investments. You know, the federal government pays, NIH pays for some grants, but in order to take technology and scale, you need private investments. And so investors really have a role to play here to ensure that the data, the technology, the innovations that are created equitably. And we can use our capital to really move in that way. And our organization is one of those organizations that does that. So the short answer is the government hasn't quite gotten there yet, and we're not terribly optimistic that they'll get there soon, but all of us have a role to play in this space, and I think we should play our parts to ensure that the work is done equitably and inclusively, and it's not causing more harm that's already out there.
I would draw your attention, though. There is one federal agency that's really been putting a lot of effort into it, and other agencies, including the CDC, point to this. NIST, so the National Institute for Standards and Technology, is an organization that has, from very early days, put out sort of a couple different pieces and white papers and other policies on the use of AI. And so they're kind of one of the agencies that a lot of people look to for this type of guidance. The second thing is I currently serve on a panel for National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine. And so we're in the process of putting together a code of conduct around the use of AI. And so while it's not governmental, it produces reports that then government agencies can point to. So I think it's likely to be like many things, like a public-private partnership, where we end up with something that looks like, again, it's not going to be perfect, but you start having some sort of guideposts that provide some safety bounds that people should ideally adhere to.
Let me dig a little deeper there. So if I think about the trilogy of the academic domain, industry, and government, how are those all going to come together? And I guess the question here is, what role does industry play? Is it going to monitor itself? Is it going to be advisory panels that are going to be out ahead and will be advising the government? How do you think that's going to play out?
Well, go ahead.
So I would say from an industry perspective, the capital rules all. So I think investors play a significant role in this. If investors come together and say, this is the type of work we want to fund, this is the type of innovation we want to fund, from pre-seed, Series A, all the way through the alphabet, I think industry will respond in kind. I would also say from an industry perspective, in the pharma space, there are additional regulations that need to happen there, and that kind of happens outside of the investment, the venture capital world, but eventually it moves into pharma. Same for the private equity space. So I think industry can monitor in some ways, but in other ways, it's kind of the wild, wild west. So especially for those early stage investments. So I think we can, we just need to come together and do that.
I don't think this is new. I mean, technology has always been advancing. And I think the history in this country has been that there's always an interplay between industry and government and academia. I think internet sort of initial days, similar types of things. But you oftentimes see where there's a federal agency, they'll put together panels that are staffed primarily by industry. And that works, depending on how cynical you are, that could work so. A lot of underpinnings of how data moves across institutions is underpinned by a nonprofit, this HL7 sort of group. FIRE is a standard that's used. That's an industry sort of primarily driven effort with some nonprofits involved. That seems to work okay. And then on the federal side, you have Office of National Coordinator, who's sort of helping to provide additional guideposts. This interplay has been always the case.
Les, do you think this has been a Microsoft heavy? By the way, there was no paid endorsement of any kind by Microsoft in this. But do you folks have a preference when using tools of the most common publicly available ones out there? And any advantages of one over the other that drive you in one direction?
From a prototyping aspect, there's a variety of models for which there are minimal costs to use from a prototyping perspective. However, I agree with the other speakers that in terms of at the moment today, the GPT-4 and the latest versions do tend to present more holistic responses. If one is looking, on the other hand, for following sets of directions specifically that are given explicitly to a model, and you have a double check in place with additional low or no cost models, those actually can perform very well for those perspectives as well. One other thing I'll just comment on from the other theme a little bit too was we have all the cybersecurity risks that we're all highly aware of. And with that sort of thing, there's a lot of academic researchers, bringing back the academic and the government in that regard, who we rely upon to identify problems ahead of time and report them before they could actually be used for harm in that fashion. So I would say one additional role from academia in this regard, as these tools become available, is to encourage and support researchers investigating where are these vulnerabilities, where can things be used in ways that are not intended, with a way towards effectively implementing some of those safeguards too.
Well, thank you all very much. And what I'd like to do, what I do with all my patients when I finish my exam in the room is, I said, did I give you a chance to say everything you wanted that was important to you? So let me each give you, not each of you, but if any of you have something burning that you didn't get to get across to people that you want to, this is your opportunity to do that. It's okay if not, but just want to make sure that we
Only
cover.
thing I would say is that we're still early days. I mean, I think there is so much excitement about this. It's evolving so quickly. We have a hard time keeping up. So what we've done is the tables have turned. Instead of professors being the leaders, oftentimes we find our students and people coming and are oftentimes smarter about these things than we are. We've embraced that, and we have found that they can sometimes help guide us and lead the way.
Perfect. Well, thank you all very much. Oh, sure, Crystal.
One
Sorry.
more. If you are an innovator and you think you have a technology, an innovation, or a tool that is addressing some of these issues and it affects women's health, we would love it if you sent that our way. We want to make an investment in this space, so send it our way. You can go to RH Capital, you can pitch us on that site. And if you're an innovator and you're curious about how to make your tools more equitable, you can let us know. You can reach out to me. I think my contact information is somewhere around. I'm happy to help in that way.
Perfect. Well, thank you all very much. I appreciate it tremendously. And I will say, in terms of it being early in the game, Steve Collins and I already had a discussion coming in here with the power and the force of all the people that were interested in this. How can we think about what we can do collectively going forward to continue these? And our early ideas, maybe taking a deep dive and have a seminar series where we would take a deep dive into one issue as opposed to the smorgasbord menu that we had today as an intro. So look forward to that and collaborating to make that happen.
So I should product plug. We do have an AI forum every other week, and that's something that on the university side we'd welcome. And actually some of the team here has actually presented at that. And we'd love to sort of work with you on that. So
Great, thank you. Appreciate it, everybody. You could just leave your mics turned off on the chair. I'm going to do a quick summary and then let you all go. Thank you very much. So let me start at a very high and basic level, and that is my plea or my request for you is just get in the game. It's important to get in the game, and it could be daunting. I would point out two things. Number one, it's called ChatGTP, and it's not an accident that it's chat, which means if you want to use the tool effectively, you need to converse with the tool, because anybody that's worked on it realizes the more you converse, the more powerful it is. And this will sound kind of cheesy, but my wife and I signed up for a Coursera course on ChatGTP, and it's been very enlightening, and there's several different streams of it. So again, in the spirit of just getting in the game, I'd encourage you to start there, because using the tool and how you use it is very, very important. Couple comments or observations from each of the talks that went there. First of all, I'd say that when I think back to Harjinder's talk, I'm taken away with remember the funnel he showed? I thought that was very important, because what it does, it goes from being overwhelmed to getting something done. And the funnel starts with risk, performance, cost, operationalization, and deployment. And I know we use that here, and I'd encourage everybody to think about that as a sort of go-to strategy and how you think about that. In Farouk's presentation, I think I was particularly impressed with and kind of resonated with the don't boil the ocean approach. So what happened was he took his company, he got a lot of learning in radiology, and then he applied it in this concierge model, but he didn't try to solve everything at once. And he was like Willie Sutton, he went where the money was, where he thought that he can generate revenue and a compelling case. And that came up with this concierge model, so it wasn't boiling the ocean. With Sam's presentation with Level X, 2 comments about that. Number 1, lessons learned from other industry. How many times in healthcare do we learn and do we get most excited when we go somewhere and we take a lesson learned from an industry outside of healthcare and then apply it to us? So I'd encourage each of you to open your aperture and look elsewhere for other learnings, whether it's in the gaming industry or elsewhere. Open the aperture to look for other things. And then I was particularly struck with the fact that he said, go after hard problems, and that it was really tempting and easy to say, let's think about using this for the grunt work. This reminds me of a project we're doing at Hospital at Home. Most people, when they look at Hospital at Home, us included, are looking at the really simple things for Hospital at Home, like a cellulitis or a pneumonia. But Mayo, for instance, is looking at saying, we're turning it upside down and saying, we're looking at taking the most complicated patients and perhaps doing Hospital Home with those. And Sam has an analogy there of let's use this for some of the most complicated problems, not for the grunt work problems. And then finally, in Rhia's presentation in the DAX, how many of you believe or know or think that 5 years from now, we're not going to be in a state where probably 95% of our typing is going to go away? No matter where it is, in any part of our life, the idea of sitting in front of a keyboard is going to be gone. It's all going to be with language text, with use of language and free text from that. So I think it's kind of fascinating how we think about that. And then finally, the last observation is about sort of efficiency and using the right tool. And I'm reminded of a story about the space station. And there were Israeli scientists and American scientists, and they were sharing notes, and the American scientists were displaying the joy that they had about the creation of solving a zero gravity problem with a pen that NASA created. And they claimed, we have this pen that works in zero gravity. It only cost us $250,000 to develop it. And the Israeli scientists said, oh, that's really interesting. We use a pencil. So the idea of directing the technology and the use of it and tying that to the cost. The example here was about using ChatGPT-4 and how expensive it is. So it's really tailoring the technology to the need you have and not being seduced by that shiny object and saying we're going to apply this everywhere, but using common sense about where we apply it, I think is going to be really important going forward. So I want to thank Stephen and the team, the whole team from Matter and our team for doing a lot of legwork. One of our main worker bees on this was Sal from our innovation team that is out on paternity leave. So I want to at least make a nod to Sal for all the good work that he did as well. And we hope to come back to you with another round in several months. So thank you all very much for the time and energy you put into this program.